Obviously, there are two stories there. Whether they happened one right after another, we don't know. Whether there was a period between the first and the second, we don't know. Mark puts them together, and you have to ask yourself the question, why are these two stories connected? Is there something there rather that will pull them together? Because most of the time, we want to read one story of Jesus and try to figure out what's going on there before we hop along to a new one. And these are two distinct events, even if they happened one right after another or rather simultaneous to one another. There are two separate things going on. The first is Jesus' condemnation of the scribes. And the second, of course, is the story of the widow's mite, as it's traditionally called. Let's talk about the scribes first. They're obviously an important part of the gospel story. Jesus has many conflicts with them, along with the Pharisees. The scribes generally are associated with Pharisees. The Pharisees were the forerunner of what would be modern-day rabbis, and I suppose they really don't have anything like scribes anymore. But the scribes were rather like church lawyers, if you will. That their task was to interpret the law of Moses. Their job was to advise the Pharisees, even the priests or the Sadducees too, if need be, because they were like ecclesiastical lawyers. And you know, there used to be ecclesiastical lawyers in the church. Back in pre-modern times, back in the Middle Ages, from early in the church's life all the way up until the Reformation, there were people who were church lawyers. They needed them to interpret legal things, to draft documents. They needed them to copy things that had to be copied. But they also had courts back in the day. When there was no separation between church and state, if you were a member of the state, the country, a citizen, then you were also a member of the church. And if you became someone who was expelled or excommunicated from the church, you would also be expelled from your citizenship. In fact, what would happen if you didn't escape is that you would be put to death. Because if you're not a member of the church, you can't be a member of the state. If you're not a citizen of the state, you can't be a member of the church. They worked in tandem. But there were other courts, and there were ecclesiastical courts. What would happen if you didn't put in the right amount of money that you were supposed to put in the offering plate? What would happen if you missed a bunch of Sundays and didn't go to Mass on any of those Sundays, or you worked on a holiday, or you did something else like that? You would actually be running afoul of the law. And there were courts that you could be indicted to go into. And in the church of that day, the church lawyers, the ecclesiastical lawyers, would prosecute the case. They would prepare the case. It would look just like a regular courtroom. And one of the great reformers, John Calvin, actually was one of those ecclesiastical lawyers before he became a Protestant Christian. It was very much a part of the church's life. The same thing in Jesus' day. Who could remember all of the law? It wasn't all written down. Sure, the Ten Commandments were there. You had those, and you had other laws from Leviticus and Deuteronomy especially that were like statutes that the people were to follow, that told you what you could and you couldn't eat, told you when you could and couldn't eat, told you how to wash your hands and do all the rituals that had to be done. But that wasn't enough, because, you know, law is something that has to be interpreted. I've used the example many times before. The commandment in the Ten Commandments says, do not work on the Sabbath day. Don't do it. It's against God's law. So, in time, somebody would start asking the question, okay, well, what constitutes work? How do we distinguish work from play? Or is play also work? How do we figure all of this out? That's where the scribes came in. They would interpret the law. And since it wasn't written down, their charge was to learn as much of it as they could so that they could advise the Pharisees, who were the teachers of the law, to get it right. So there were all of these rituals and rules that had to do with how you prepared food, with how you washed your hands in order to eat, what you could eat, what you could serve, and there were all of these rules about what constituted work and what didn't. And if you look at Orthodox Judaism, even today, you still have many of those same rules. There are so many steps that you can walk on a Sabbath day before it becomes work. One step beyond that limit, then you violated the law. If your car is wrecked or something like that, are you able to get it out on a Sabbath day? All of that would be something that would have to be interpreted by the scribes. That's what they did. And so if someone in Jesus' day, like Jesus himself, ran afoul of some of those laws, then the scribes would be the one who would tell the Pharisees what they needed to do. And you know in the stories of the gospel that they got on to Jesus several times because his disciples were picking grain on a Sabbath day. Because Jesus healed on a Sabbath day, they accused him of being a lawbreaker. That's where the scribes came in. And while not all of them were opposed to Jesus, the vast majority of them were. They thought Jesus was a traitor to his faith. They thought Jesus was trying to introduce something new that wasn't part of the faith. They thought Jesus was a lawbreaker because of the things that he had done. And while it seems almost inconceivable to us today, if you really read the story, you can hear, you can see, you can feel the passion in those gospel stories where Jesus healed someone on the Sabbath day, and the Pharisees, mostly because they were advised by the scribes, I suspect, actually accused Jesus of being possessed by a demon, being of Satan, because he healed someone on the Sabbath day. So what the scribes would advise is that God would rather let someone suffer than to heal them on the Sabbath day, because that's work. And that's what Jesus did, and that's why Jesus got into trouble, and that's why Jesus himself was often opposed to the scribes themselves. They were the lawyers. They didn't like what Jesus did. They got on to him about it. And Jesus usually, well, he always did, actually turned the tables back on them and showed that they were, in fact, hypocrites. That word hypocrite comes from the Greek word, and it means to be a stage actor. Jesus is accusing the scribes of being like stage actors. They're hypocrites. They don't live what they preach. They don't do what they say to others to do. And they're very much out in the public in such a way that they want to be seen. And that's the accusation that Jesus leveled against them. What did he say? They love to get out in the public and wear their long robes, like a uniform. Now, let me ask you, if you were doing something maybe that was questionable, and there were just a few other people around you who might see it, that might not stop you. But if you saw a deputy or a police officer or a highway patrolman standing nearby, you might think twice before you went ahead and did what you were going to do. Why? Because of that uniform. You know that person has authority. You know that person can get you. It was the same way in Jesus' day. By wearing their robes and their long robes and their uniforms, that they would be seen by the public and deferred to. They liked to be honored. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to be looked up to. They wanted the best seats in the synagogue. They wanted the head table at banquets. They loved their authority. They loved that they had authority over people. And they wanted people to see, know, and understand who they were. In other words, they like to show off. Now, I wear a robe, long too. But my tradition goes back to Wesley. You know why Wesley wanted his preachers to wear robes? Because obviously, in that day, just as in our day, there were some who had a great deal of money. And there were some who couldn't afford to buy a suit of clothes. And Wesley didn't want that to be a distraction in any church where they served, so he wanted his preachers to wear robes so that wherever you went, they all looked the same. It wasn't to be a show-off. It wasn't to be deferred to, though I'm sure some have done that. It was simply so they could look the same wherever they were to any other preacher. But it wasn't so with the Pharisees and the scribes. They liked to be dressed up. They liked being looked up to. They liked their authority. And they would exercise it whenever they could. They liked having people obey them. They didn't like people like Jesus who challenged them. They didn't like when their authority got questioned. And Jesus said, beware of these people because they are hypocrites. They are stage actors. They're doing what they do in order to be seen, in order to gain, in order to be number one, and not because of anything in their hearts that make them want to really serve God. And so, no matter what you did, if you deferred to what they said, they would leave you alone. If you didn't, they would do what they needed to do in order to make sure that you were punished for the crime or the sins that you had committed. That's who the scribes were. Jesus said they do it not because they love the law of God, though I'm sure some did. He's not talking about all of them, but the ones that he encountered. They're not doing it because they love the law of God or even love God. They're doing it because they want to be seen and have authority. And pretty quickly, the gospel account transitions into the next story. There's the widow. Now, in our day, widows probably have it a whole lot better. I mean, there are safety nets like Social Security, retirement programs, things like that weren't around then. And in Jesus' day, women weren't highly regarded. They didn't have rights like men have rights. They didn't own property. If they had nowhere to go when their husband died, if they didn't have their father's household or their brother's household that they could go into, it would be very likely that they would end up as beggars in the street or as prostitutes in order to get by. And for that reason, the Bible teaches, both Old and New Testament, that when we take care of widows, we're doing the will of God. They had no status. They were among the most vulnerable people in the world. And so in the story, this poor widow went to the temple, watched and waited in line for her turn to put something or drop something into the basket or the bucket. And what she dropped in was a penny. All those that had gone before, and I'm sure many that came after, put in larger sums. Somebody might have dropped in a 50. Somebody else might have dropped in 100. If they were standing in line, I have no doubt that there probably sometimes was some one-upmanship going on. If the guy in front of me put in $50, I want to make sure that others see me put in more than what he put in. They didn't have checks back then, but if they had, somebody might have thought, well, I don't have enough cash, so I'll just write a bigger check than all of them. And they put it in. Nothing wrong with that. Jesus didn't condemn the act of giving. Nothing wrong with them giving their resources to be used for God's purposes. Not at all. But the widow came along and she dropped in a single penny. It was all she had. She didn't have a 50 or 100 or a checkbook to write a check on. She gave all that she had. And what do we learn from that? We learn from Jesus directly that God honors what the widow did much more than those who went before her who put in more money. Why? Because she gave out of her poverty, whereas they gave out of their abundance. If you have $1 billion, giving away 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 million, you wouldn't even miss it, would you? But if all you got is a penny, and you put that in, you're going to miss it. But she put in everything that she had in order to honor God with her possessions and her life. And Jesus says to the disciples that her gift was worth more in God's eyes than all the rest of them, because she stepped out on faith. Simple faith. She gave everything that she had, believing that God would make provision for her. Whereas everybody else gave, and they gave out of their abundance, even if they gave a lot, it wasn't a demonstration of faith. It's not the amount someone puts in, it's the sacrifice that it causes you to make that matters to God. And if the gift is not sacrificial, then it's not as important as what that widow did. And I think that example story Jesus regarded as an important one, and the gospel writers made sure that they kept that in their narratives because it was a demonstrative story. If your faith doesn't cost you anything, then it doesn't mean that much. So the widow stepped out on faith by giving everything that she had, trusting in the future provision of God, whereas those others simply didn't. Now, those are two very separate stories. How do we connect them up? What's a line that runs through both of them, the reason they were included in the gospel? Faith is very, very important. The kind of faith you demonstrate is very, very important. You know as well as I do in the church, you've seen it like I have, there are some folks who want you to know how good a Christian they are. And if you don't know, they're going to tell you. They're going to tell you everything you need to do in order to be a good Christian. They're going to tell you who you need to vote for. They're going to tell you what you need to believe in. They're going to tell you how you should live your life, and usually it means living it like I'm living it. They're the ones who would put bumper stickers on their car that advertises their faith. They're the ones that would speak up in public places and say, I am a Christian, and so we don't need to be doing that. Sometimes Christians, like the scribes, are hypocrites, play actors, wearing a mask, showing off. And I've concluded in my own life over the years that if I have to tell people how Christian I am, I'm not very Christian. It's like the widow. The more you give sacrificially, the more you're going to be honored by God. If you're really living your life as a Christian, showing your faith in Jesus is something you don't have to tell other people you do. They will see it. They will understand it. They will ask questions about it. And it may even be that they tell you they want it because of the difference they see that is made in your life. When we live in faith, we don't have to live like the scribes. We can live like the widow. We can step out and let others see Jesus in us. And that is our witness. We don't need to beat people over the head. We don't need to make laws that require them to go to church or that make people do this or do that. We need to live the life that Christ wants us to live. And when we do that, we will change people and we will change the world. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.